Hey, it's been a while. Today we're going to learn about vocal subharmonics and why everyone seems to be missing some sneaky things. This is a theory video, so if you're one of my viewers just trying to copy inertia or remix, your princess is in a different castle. Shout out to Calapuico and Maze Frog for debating related ideas with me. You should definitely check them out if you haven't already. Sources include Wikipedia, CVT Research, Wolfram, Leonardo Fuchs, and Ingo Tietze. Shout out to them as well. Also, I'm not so back on YouTube. Still quite busy, but wanted to get this out so I can stop repeating myself in Beatbox discussions. Before we start, here's a small promotion. This video is brought to you by Beatblox.tech. Beatblox is basically an interpreter for beatbox patterns. Instead of sending your friends a wall of hieroglyphics to explain how you do something, send them a Beatblox link and let me just show you. I've been trying to learn one of Zeka's patterns from Kickback, but my rhythmic sense isn't great, so learning it from the video was really hard. Luckily, my friend Kala could figure it out and sent me the pattern on Beatblox where it's much easier to understand. So yeah, if you're a beatbox teacher or just into structure and technicality, check out Beatblox, otherwise I'll frame your toaster oven for starting an illegal tomato farm. Anyways, back to subharmonics. Let's start with this question. What is a subharmonic? A subharmonic is simply a note with a pitch or frequency that is some special fraction of the pitch or frequency of another anchor note, commonly referred to as the fundamental. For example, if my fundamental is concert A4 at 440 Hz, A3 on a lower string with half the frequency would be one of its subharmonics. Subharmonics often appear together with their fundamentals, but can also refer to separate tones with the right fraction of pitch like I just showed on my violin. So what special fractions qualify as subharmonic? Well, as the name would imply, fractions that exist in the harmonic sequence. The harmonic sequence is a simple sequence of numbers used often in physics that goes 1, 1 over 2, 1 over 3, 1 over 4, 1 over 5, and so on. For this video, we mainly care about fractions starting from 1 over 2. Notice as the fractions we care about are less than 1, subharmonics are always lower pitched than their fundamental. The first subharmonic would be 1/2 the fundamental's pitch, i.e. an octave down, like the A3 I played relative to the A4 I played. The second subharmonic would be 1/3 the fundamental's pitch, i.e. an octave and a fifth down, etc. Then putting in the final piece, this video is about vocal subharmonics, so subharmonics you can produce with things in your throat, i.e. your voice. Here's an example. Of course, I'm not unfamiliar either. Cool, that's easy. So what's the problem? Well, everyone keeps giving incorrect explanations about how vocal subharmonics work. Ever since David Larson became known in the beatbox community, every high IQ beatboxer and vocal science expert started proclaiming their genius understanding of subharmonics, acting like finding the first result for undertones on Wikipedia was the same as discovering water on Mars, and despite spamming unnecessarily complicated words while trying to not so subtly brag about how smart they are after doing nothing more than inputting a file into a spectrograph, they all seem to conveniently ignore this sentence from the third paragraph of their secret research source. Oh wait, I did that. Shit. Basically, beatboxers and vocalists have adopted an incorrect notion of how vocal subharmonics work. We think simply doing two pitches some interval like a perfect fifth apart results in a subharmonic of the lower note, but not all subharmonics work the same way. For brevity, I'm going to refer to this whole umbrella of ideas as bro just a fifth, the bro being optional. We then overextended 3 just a fifth theories when we should have been pressing X to doubt. The first theory is vocal subharmonics don't actually exist and are only auditory hallucinations people experience. The second is vocal subharmonics are the result of an inner ear peculiarity, and the trickiest is vocal subharmonics happen because of magic wave math from simply doing sounds at the same time. So that you'll be more prepared to call out scarlet rot when you smell it, let's now look at how these 3 theories explain subharmonic phenomenon, then debunk just a fifth itself when it comes to vocal subharmonics. Pseudo-theory 1. It's imagination. People commonly experience an illusory subharmonic when hearing acoustic notes at certain intervals like a perfect fifth. Illusory as in there's no actual wave in reality with a frequency matching the subharmonic's pitch. It's all in the listener's head. But wait, I trust what I hear and I know I hear a subharmonic. Don't gaslight me, kindred. I'm not. You're actually gaslighting yourself, and this is called the missing fundamental phenomenon. So how does this work? Acoustic notes are often accompanied by many overtones, also known as harmonics, not to be confused with subharmonics. Harmonics occur due to qualities of the musical instruments that produce them. Harmonics, unlike subharmonics, have periods rather than frequencies that get scaled by the harmonic sequence, and if you were awake during middle school science, you should remember a wave's period is equal to 1 divided by its frequency. Once again, the harmonic sequence is 1, 1 over 2, 1 over 3, 1 over 4, etc. So if you multiply the period by a number from the harmonic sequence, its frequency will get scaled up to keep the equation balanced, i.e. the first harmonic will be twice the frequency or 1 octave up, the second harmonic will be 3 times the frequency or 1 octave and a fifth up, the third harmonic will be 4 times the frequency or 1 octave and a fifth and a fourth or 2 octaves up, you get it. Now imagine you acoustically played 2 notes a fifth apart, let's say C4 and G4. These notes are accompanied by their harmonics whose frequencies are multiples of that of C4 and G4. Your brain collects all these frequencies from your ears and goes, wait, I feel something is missing. You see, the frequencies from the fundamental and overtones of the 2 acoustic notes we played match almost all the lower harmonics of C3. This almost complete set of harmonics pointing at C3 tricks your brain into thinking, how could I hear all these harmonics for C3 but not C3 itself? I must actually be hearing C3, and thus you experience the illusion of hearing C3 even when in reality we know C3 is 404 not found. The illusion works out so that if the 2 original notes were a perfect fifth apart, the note your brain imagines will be an octave down from the lower of the 2 notes, i.e. the first subharmonic of the fundamental. It's an interesting cognitive quirk that conveniently aligns with what just a fifth predicts, perhaps an evolutionary defense mechanism where creating awareness for a false positive is preferred in case there really is an error in your hardware and you miss some predator's low-pitched growl amidst the noise of 33-mile-an-hour wind on a Switch Sports golf course. But a theory isn't much of a theory if it explains something you're not trying to explain, and as we'll see later, this does not explain vocal subharmonics, so scoop it up nicely and put it in the recycling bin to be repurposed for a different exploration. Pseudo-theory 2, its anatomy. A long time ago, this dude named Tartini discovered another just a fifth phenomenon that apparently happens because non-linearity of the inner ear causes intermodulation distortion of the frequencies that go in your ear, which results in you hearing faint subharmonics. Basically, your ear creates subharmonics out of the sounds that go in, then you hear those subharmonics. Unfortunately, I'm not paid enough to explain this fully. Stay in school, pay attention in algebra, and don't fall asleep during a snarky hypothetical I'll give later. You'll realize it's not actually that complicated. For now, the key takeaway is this theory explains what your ear makes you hear, and we'll see later, despite once again being able to, this theory does not explain vocal subharmonics. So scoop it up nicely and put it in the recycling bin next to the missing fundamental phenomenon. Pseudo-theory 3. It's math. A common high school science experiment is to ring 2 tuning forks, then count the pulses on a waveform graph corresponding to a subharmonic of the lower tuning fork's pitch.
Wah, 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 wah.
Like the missing fundamental, this subharmonic also does not exist, but instead of only being in the listener's head, it's a mathematical artifact resulting in a perceptual illusion. But wait, I can see the subharmonic on a spectrogram and I trust what I see. Don't gaslight me again, kindred. I'm not, but you're not either. Unfortunately, this time you're just being stupid. This mathematical artifact happens due to what's commonly called beats in acoustics, unrelated to the common notion of a beat like in beatboxing.
That wobble is a beat frequency.
Let's again take a look at how this works. When you play different sounds in the same space, the sound waves simply add to each other. This is literally adding sines and cosines. And when it comes to adding sines and cosines, there's common trigonometric identities that show us what happens. Think back to high school trigonometry. There was this thing you probably had to memorize for an exam that went cosine of f1x plus cosine of f2x equals 2 times cosine of f1 plus f2 over 2x times cosine of f2 minus f1 over 2x. This sum to product identity tells us when you play two notes, say C4 and G4 again in the same space, they add to give a resultant sound wave that looks like this. These wave lumps with another wave inside are the acoustic beats. The wave inside each beat has the average frequency of C4 and G4, while the wave lumps are enveloped by a wave with half the frequency of G4 minus C4. This envelope wave determines how fast the beats come. The interesting thing is, you get 2 beats for each cycle of the envelope wave, i.e. the beats come at twice the frequency of the envelope wave. But since our ears don't care about the cycle of waves and just pick up on the pulses, what we hear is the frequency of the beats, also known as the beat wave, not the envelope wave. 2 times half the frequency of G4 minus C4 is just the frequency of G4 minus C4, or 131 Hz. But wait! 131 Hz is also half the frequency of C4, it's the frequency of C3, an octave down from C4, the first subharmonic. In fact, this works for all the subharmonics. If my fundamental has frequency F, by definition, the note a perfect fifth above has frequency 3 over 2F, a perfect fourth would be 4 over 3F, a major third would be 5 over 4F, a minor third would be 6 over 5F, etc. Then, as we just showed, the beat wave for each interval has the frequency of the higher note minus the lower note, and obviously, if you subtract 1 from any of these fractions, you'd get 1 over the denominator, lining up with the harmonic sequence. My Reddit IQ viewers will now go, dude, doesn't that explain everything? Book closed, test aced, problem solved, rocket launched, game won, warriors don't read books. Yeah, unfortunately, no. The beat wave only describes what we hear. It only describes how you're interpreting the pulses on a spectrogram. It's not actually part of the sound wave in reality. Actually, for beat waves to work at all, there's a lot of criteria that detract from the generality of just a fifth itself. There seems to be resonance and instrumental requirements. As with pipe organs, smaller pipes in drier rooms seem to produce an unconvincing effect. If the 2 notes are too close together, the subharmonic will just come across as wobbling. And while needing citation on Wikipedia, people seem to conveniently ignore this sensible sentence in their secret research source. The higher pitch shouldn't be more than 7 over 6 times the fundamental's frequency, which is already smaller than the first subharmonic at 3 over 2. Otherwise, most people will just perceive the notes separately without any subharmonics. Take a step back and think about just a fifth for a second. If simply doing 2 pitches a perfect fifth apart should be called a subharmonic, then any common chord on the piano would be subharmonic, your polyphonic sounds would be subharmonic, tuning your violin would be subharmonic, the little kids in preschool choir are subharmonic, even you and your anime waifu arguing could be subharmonic. This is obviously not a sensible way to think about things. Like, don't get me wrong, acoustic beats do get produced. Not even science, this happens at the math level and isn't up for debate. Slightly off-tune overtones of different sounds can result in beat waves that get perceived as additional, more transient notes, augmenting the overall fullness of harmonies. And I believe beat waves play a role in how we experience our own basses. The resonance in our heads likely amplifies the effect like crazy. But ultimately, this is insufficient for understanding the main mechanism behind vocal subharmonics. Let's now find out why. People who are good at vocal bass, like Indicator or Leonardo Fuchs, produce stable subharmonics that show up on spectrograms. This fact alone is actually all we need to debunk just a fifth. But first, we need to unpack how the thing that creates spectrograms, a spectrograph, works. Recall from the acoustic beats section that waves in nature simply add to each other when they're in the same space. Even the most complicated sounds can be constructed from simply adding mixtures of basic sine and cosine waves at different volumes. A spectrograph takes a complicated waveform and decomposes it into the frequencies of these basic waves that were combined to create it, sort of like Gordon Ramsay figuring out which ingredients were used after eating someone's cooking. For brevity, I'll refer to these ingredient waves as the basis. The way spectrographs decompose waveforms is mathematically reversible, meaning if you combine the same basis waves at the same intensities, you will always get the same resulting waveform, and the same waveform will always decompose to the same basis waves with the same intensities. We can see this clearly with computer-generated sound waves. Notice how frequencies for the double stop are exactly the frequencies of the 2 notes that create it. Think about that for a second. Let's say vocal subharmonics worked like the just a fifth model predicted. Suppose that in order to get a waveform with a subharmonic, the ingredients I combine are a fundamental note and a note a perfect fifth above that fundamental. Then where in the vibration base is the subharmonic below the fundamental coming from? It wouldn't be part of the basis, so the spectrogram can't detect it, but there it is being detected. If you believe the missing fundamental, inner ear, or acoustic beats theory, well, spectrographs aren't your boyfriend. They can't read your mind and tell you what notes you are hearing. This contradiction of vocal subharmonics showing up on spectrograms despite not being directly produced according to the just a fifth model is what invalidates it. Okay, nerd, now what? I basically just said nothing makes sense and no one knows anything, but subharmonics happen, so how do you explain them? Well, if in order for a subharmonic to register in a spectrograph, something in your throat has to actually be vibrating at the subharmonic's frequency, and we see the subharmonic register on a spectrograph, the true explanation for how vocal subharmonics occur is you simply sing lower. You think I was joking? This is actually all that happens. In fact, if all of us Beatbox science nerds actually paid attention and read the Wikipedia article on undertone singing itself, we'd have noticed this sentence. Yeah, the answer was in front of us the whole time, and scientists have known about this since at least 1996. Subharmonics occur in, say, Kargira because your false folds just vibrate at the subharmonic's frequency. That's all. Sorry, reducing the salt. To summarize, the key takeaways are subharmonics happen in different ways. Some are acoustic illusions, while others are for real and will be detected by a spectrograph. Vocal subharmonics from beatbox and singing techniques can be detected by a spectrograph, so they occur for real, meaning something in your throat is just vibrating at the subharmonic's frequency. Additionally, correlation isn't causation. Ooga booga numbers same isn't strong evidence an idea should be accepted. For example, here's an explanation I invented in a few minutes called ring modulation and phase shift. Vocal subharmonics happen because when you vocalize two notes a fifth apart and resonate those basses in your nose and mouth at the same time, the resonance causes ring modulation in each chamber, and the distance between the nasal and throat chambers creates a phase shift, resulting in this sound wave. You can check on Wolfram Alpha or ChatGPT that all the subharmonics are correct by changing F1 and F2 to be a fifth, fourth, third, etc. apart. Just ignore what I said about sound waves adding in nature, making ring modulation unsensible. And finally, the reason all of this is important is because if how you think about something is fundamentally incorrect, putting in effort with that understanding will not help you improve. Your vibration bass might still sound like poop live because all your relevant efforts have been guided by a belief that doesn't actually give you a deeper bass. Obviously, the true theory behind subharmonics is not very satisfying. Even though we know why vocal subharmonics happen, it doesn't really give a clear explanation for how we can produce them. But this is just where Wikipedia has left things, so I want to explain how I model the theory since I think that can give a bit more insight. Of course, as it's my interpretation, one that's barely educated, future research may invalidate it. Don't turn off your brain and take what I say with a serving of caution. I think there are two ways just sing lower theory can be modeled. Which way makes sense depends on how your voice, produced by your vocal folds, gets modified, or in acoustics terminology, modulated. First, we have subharmonic singing, where your voice gets modulated by your vocal folds themselves. And second, we have all the other vocal bases where your voice gets modulated by not your vocal folds. Starting with subharmonic singing, to be honest, I'm not sure this technique works how subharmonic singers say it works. The prevailing explanation is you modulate your normal voice by combining it with vocal fry, but vocal fry requires compressing the vocal folds to a point where it doesn't really make sense to me conceptually. I'm suspicious the explanation is intuitive rather than descriptive. Unfortunately, my vocal awareness is in Game Boy Color resolution, so let's assume the subharmonic singers are right, provide an idea, and move on. Just up that serving of caution to a full course meal of disbelief since we're entering kindred conspiracy land. To understand how we might sensibly model adding vocal fry to your normal voice to produce a subharmonic, let's look at how our vocal folds work. You can think of your voice as basically a smooth stream of air getting chopped up into a bubble beam by your vocal folds, where the rate of the bubbles determines the fundamental pitch of your voice, each bubble representing a peak in the sound wave. Here's an animation of the vocal folds at work during normal phonation. This suggests a bubble beam that looks like this. On the other hand, vocal fry happens when the vocal folds are compressed to create a relatively large mass that vibrates irregularly as air gets bubbled through. I believe that type of airflow would look like this when the cadence is made regular. Then combining the two, since vocal fry is tighter and slower than normal phonation, I'd guess some normal phonation bubbles just get squashed to produce the subharmonic, like 1 out of every 2 for the first subharmonic. Notice how the bubble beam, I'm guessing, matches the waveform for adding a fundamental and its first subharmonic. Basically, it's like playing 2D whack-a-mole with a hydraulic press. We might predict the ends of bubbles in the combined bubble beam to get clipped off by the medial vocal fry pressure, perhaps explaining why we commonly hear crackling in sung subharmonic notes.
Break those.
We'd also predict more pressured vocal fry to give lower subharmonics by squashing more normal phonation bubbles in a row, so 2 out of every 3 for the second subharmonics, 3 out of every 4 for the third subharmonic, etc. Now to throw a wrench into things. Researchers 1 thought subharmonic singing was due to combining normal phonation and falsetto, and 2 suggested an explanation that involved doing falsetto a fifth above the fundamental, basically going back to the acoustic beats, i.e. superposition in nonlinear systems, to get the subharmonic difference tone. Addressing the first point, here's endoscopic vocal folds footage they caught of one subharmonic cycle. The movement diagram is almost the flip of the vocal fry model I made up. Basically, instead of every other bubble getting squashed out for the first subharmonic, every other valley got expanded, corresponding to the vocal folds not fully closing here in the footage. It doesn't matter if the vibration is a squashing or expanding one, as long as there's a wave at that frequency, the spectrograph will pick it up. This expanding vibration makes sense since falsetto happens when you phonate in a breathier way while preventing your vocal folds from fully closing, i.e. the coordination used to achieve falsetto would match with the expanding action observed. Addressing the second point, I believe the researchers are blundering here. Yes, I'm aware I have no vocal acoustics research experience, nor do I understand all the jargon used in the paper. I'm not just being contrarian here with arrogant self-delusion, but a few points give me motivation to contradict. To start, the researchers themselves don't seem to be fully certain. The acoustic beats explanation seems to be offered more as an idea rather than something definitive. Their own spectrogram shows the subharmonic, meaning something has to be vibrating at that frequency, and if we compare their movement diagram against the perfect fifth acoustic beats graph we saw earlier, we see some subtle but important differences. But first, why would these significantly more experienced than me researchers even consider just a fifth? Where exactly does the fifth show up that would lead to this hypothesis? Unlike just adding 2 sound waves in space, your vocal folds don't really vibrate at 2 frequencies simultaneously. Rather, they directly move following the already summed wave's shape. I think this is the difference between what they call entrainment and how we might imagine a double stop working on a violin. That means we can't just point at 2 things and go, look, fundamental and fifth. Instead, we need to make a larger leap from our observations, and the observation researchers found was one related to yodeling. Roughly, if the tested singers spontaneously broke into voice crack intervals further from a perfect fifth, it was harder for them to get the first subharmonic. And if we look back at the graph of our already summed perfect fifth wave, it kind of looks like the movement diagram with this dimpled peak, right? Unfortunately, this doesn't fix the missing ingredient spectrograph issue I mentioned earlier, and there's a couple key features that differ subtly but importantly between our just a fifth wave and the movement diagram. Notice how in the just a fifth wave, the dimple is very flat and the 3 peaks per cycle don't line up, but the dimple in the movement diagram is uneven and the 3 peaks line up pretty well. Let's now look at what happens to our just a fifth wave when we add the subharmonic. I'll also scale it to 50% intensity since subharmonics tend to be softer. All of a sudden, we get a much closer match, suggesting whatever is going on with the researchers' falsetto and fundamental just a fifth subharmonic technique, it seems to cause the vocal folds to also entrain, or whatever the verb form of entrainment is, to the subharmonics frequency with a phase shift. In other words, subharmonic singing may actually be a combination of just a fifth and just sing lower. Just don't call it just sing a fifth lower because that's misleading. Being charitable to the researchers, this was a smaller study back in the 90s. They've probably already considered what I said by now, though I'm not doing more digging to confirm. Exiting conspiracy land, let's continue to modulating your voice with not your vocal folds. To make things easier to understand, let's zoom in further on false folds modulation. According to what was written on the Undertone Singing Wikipedia page, we need our false folds to simply vibrate at the subharmonics frequency. So how would this work? Imagine a medieval castle.
What?
I promise this is relevant. In order to infiltrate the walls, the enemy soldiers charge at the gates. The first soldier likely doesn't make it through and just pancakes, but with enough soldiers piling in from behind, eventually the gates give way. I believe your false folds act like the castle gates and the bubbles act like the enemy soldiers. When the first bubble hits your false folds, there's not enough momentum to fully break through. But when the second bubble smashes in from behind, their combined momentum is enough to clear the barrier. Your false folds then reset and the process starts over again. In this way, your false folds complete one cycle of opening and closing every 2 bubbles, meaning the rate your false folds vibrates at is 1/2 the rate of the bubbles. Since the rate of the bubbles represents the frequency of your voice, this means through this mechanism, your false folds will vibrate at 1/2 the frequency of your voice, i.e. at the first subharmonic. The more rigidly you hold your false folds, the more bubbles you'll need to fully break through. So when you need 3 bubbles, you'll get 1/3 the voice's frequency or the second subharmonic. 4 bubbles gives 1/4 the voice's frequency or the third subharmonic, and so on. Inconsistent tension will cause variance in the bubbles needed, perhaps explaining that unclean vibration bass that sounds like it splits. Doing some sanity checks, the need for more collisions at lower subharmonics would imply stronger vibrations. I guess this is why we often call lower subharmonics vibration bass. The subharmonics I get should also line up with the harmonic sequence. Well, I'm just dividing by whole numbers of bubbles, so I'm going to get frequencies at 1/2, 1/3, 1/4, etc. of the fundamental. And we should expect the false folds to vibrate slower than the vocal folds in endoscopic footage. Here's a high-speed video from CVT research. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. 1, 2, 3, 4. Based on their electrolaryngograms, don't worry about it, they concluded the vocal folds vibrate freely under the false folds during modulation. So we can assume our vocal folds count rhythmically continues during our false folds count, meaning the 2-to-1 ratio we think we observed went just according to Keikaku. Zooming back out, this gate and soldiers idea can then work for any type of multi-component vocal bass. The modulating component, like your arytenoids, epiglottis, or uvula, simply synchronizes to a subharmonic of your voice by buffering and releasing on pulses of the fundamental sound wave. Cool, we're done. Now that you understand how to think about the theory, let's ask how we can turn that thought into action. Like, what does synchronizing your, epiglottis to regularly compress every 3 cycles of your voice to get a second subharmonic feel like? For this video, I'm going to explain the proper way to do things. It's at least worked out for every vibration bass I know. Step 1 is understanding what it really means to get the non-vibration version of the bass you're trying to vibration clean. I call this achieving the slicer effect. Credit goes to Calipuico and Maze Frog for giving me this advice. If you're a beatboxer or vocalist struggling to integrate vocal bass into your style, pay attention. This can easily be the most important thing you take away from the video. So what is achieving the slicer effect? When you're inexperienced with a sound, it's difficult to know when you've actually gotten it. It's easy to think you've succeeded when you're really just forcing things while depending on an unhealthy dose of luck. This is especially true for vocal basses. In order to combat this source of inconsistency, we usually want to look for something that tells us, Eureka, that's it. The slicer effect is that something, a seemingly universal feeling for all vocal bass. As per the name, vocal basses should feel like the modulator is passively slicing your actively driven voice, rather than how beginners generally approach things, which is to try to actively drive both the modulator and voice. Admittedly, part of the problem is how we teach things. We'll say, do a uvula roll, then add vocalization, or do chest bass, then add your voice while mimicking Kermit the Frog. When what we should be saying is, once you understand how a uvula roll or chest bass feels, find the right vocalization where simply coordinating your vocal system into the uvula roll or chest bass position activates them. When you find the vocalization posture that works for you, the modulation layer should feel like it just clicks on top of your voice when activated, requiring almost no extra effort. For example, notice how Piwa doesn't look or sound like he's straining to hit the low pitches his uvula bass hits. Instead, it looks and sounds like he just pushes a button and it works. In before people pointlessly flex their intuitive genius in how they simply call this getting a bass clean, I think distinguishing the feeling with a fitting name is better than overloading the idea of getting something clean, if only to avoid the same confusion of appreciating everything good as structure after hearing Zero say the word once. Connecting back to our gates and soldiers model, you should be able to see how the slicer effect arises. The reason the modulation layer feels like it just clicks on without much extra effort when a vocal bass is done correctly is because the modulator is leveraging the pressure of your voice's sound wave rather than fully supplying all the gas needed to maintain its own vibration, i.e. the soldiers from your voice do all the work to open the gate periodically, while your modulator just needs to hold the closed position with enough stability. Doing 2 quick sanity checks, first, we should expect modulator vibration without vocalization to require a lot more effort than with vocalization, since the modulator needs to power itself without an underlying wave to piggyback off of. For chest bass, in order to get the same modulation vibration as feels like it requires noticeably more epiglottal pressure. You can test the other vocal bases at home. Second, if we feel like we need to force the modulator's vibration when vocalizing, we should not expect a clean subharmonic to show up on the corresponding spectrogram. The only reason you'd need to force the modulator is its compression cadence is conflicting with the bubble beam from your voice. You're trying to squash or expand a bubble or valley that doesn't want to be squashed or expanded. This is most obvious with uvula bass. Pay attention to how cleanly the overtones fall into place when we hit the subharmonic, compared to the mess we get when we don't. As a small personal aside, I actually came up with gate and soldiers before noticing the slicer effect. Still better at being a nerd than a beatboxer. Dope. Hopefully this explanation was enough to let you at least understand what to look for. If you already have a vocal bass clean, try identifying the idea in how that bass feels. Otherwise, don't worry too much if you didn't get it. Just keep an eye out for any feeling that matches what you might imagine a vocal slicer effect would feel like during your vocal bass practice. Unfortunately, the reason hard things are hard to explain is they generally boil down to some obscure feeling that's also fundamental. It often requires talent and imagination to recognize these feelings, or running around like a drunk kangaroo till two people with talent give you surgical advice. But not to leave you completely in the dust, let me give some specific things you can try to find the feeling. These will mainly be for your normal voice, since this video is in theory a vocal bass, and as I mentioned, you want your modulation layer to just feel like it clicks on once you get your voice right. 1. Try different vowels. I get the slicer effect with chest bass most easily when vocalizing on a nasal ah. No. 2. Try different accents. The most useful in my opinion are the Jayton voice, the Stitch voice,
Ohana means family,
and the Kermit the Frog voice.
Phenomena.
3. Try different pitches. Your modulator may not be able to synchronize if your voice's bubble beam is too fast or too slow. 4. Try different voice box positions. 5. Try changing nasality. My uvula bass doesn't work at all nasally. 6. Try relocating resonance. Some basses work better for me when I pull my voice to the very back of my soft palate to the point it almost feels nasal. 7. Try warming up and resting. Your bass won't feel right if your voice doesn't feel right. Take breaks and do some lip bubbling, or what the singing community calls pre-occluded vocalization, before practicing. Apparently, it produces waves that back-propagate energy to the vocal folds, obviously without straining your throat, to help them warm up. Fun fact, this exercise got so popular it even showed up in manga. Honestly, achieving the slicer effect deserves its own video. Okay, each section of this video could have been its own video. But it shows up in all sorts of roll sounds to the point I'd call it fundamental to beatboxing itself. Kala doesn't really make content, so I hope Maze can provide his own take on this concept as well. Anyways, summarizing step 1, get your non-vibration vocal bass clean by achieving the slicer effect. You want to focus on adjusting position, not pressure, in this step, since the modulator's vibration should not feel like it requires much extra effort once the position is right. This is in contrast to how most beginners approach learning vocal bass. You want to avoid the feeling of forcing your modulator to vibrate while vocalizing. If you're straining, you're doing it wrong. Step 2 is just tighten your modulator, i.e. now you care about pressure. Once you get your non-vibration bass clean and feel the slicer effect, you'll gain an intuitive understanding for how the position you found is letting your modulator ride the waves of your voice. You then need to lean into that position more, directing the increase of pressure with precision guided by your gained intuition. As you do, you'll feel a sort of magnetic snap between subharmonics if you're able to drop to lower ones, what I assume to be jumps in the number of soldiers you're buffering. I've also heard this sensation referred to as finding pockets for each subharmonic. This is why the proper way to get your vibration bass consistent is to get your non-vibration bass clean. The effortlessness people who are good at vibration bass exhibit extends from their effortlessness with the corresponding non-vibration version. Note, getting the slicer effect doesn't necessarily mean you'll get a specific subharmonic. It just means your vibrations are lining up properly. This effect can happen first for you anywhere from first subharmonic to lower subharmonics depending on your vocal system. For example, if you get the same vocalized chest bass as me, it's already at the second subharmonic. From the gates and soldiers perspective, this isn't surprising, since compared to say my false folds, which gives me a first subharmonic in its relaxed slicer effect position, my epiglottis is much more massive, so it makes sense more soldiers are needed to break through each cycle when it's also relaxed. Of course, we can still lean further and get vibration chest bass, or what I've heard called bass ventura vibration bass. Notice we're also getting a second subharmonic despite the difference in quality. This tells us vibration basing your vocal bass doesn't always give you a lower subharmonic. Sometimes it just amplifies lower harmonics or subharmonics compared to non-vibration based versions. This will still make your bass sound deeper since the lower pitched frequencies are emphasized more, without necessarily lowering the pitch of your bass at all. In before debates about whether I'm adding slizer bass or not, I feel like I'm just tightening my vocalized chest bass, so I'd say no. But my understanding is slizer bass looks like growl, which looks like how I'd imagine a constrained chest bass looks, so maybe it's just different ways of thinking about the same technique. For the bigger brain viewers, yes, I'm saying it makes more sense to associate vibration bass with the action of increasing pressurization to push the sound, not necessarily pitch, below what you can achieve relaxed, rather than saying all basses at a specific subharmonic are vibration bass when people can often get lower subharmonics without much vibrationing at all. Anyways, I know this step suffers from the same problem as the previous. Unfortunately, I'm not sure if how one person's intuition guides them will make sense to anyone else. All I can say for sure is you gain critical intuition once you achieve the slicer effect. But not to leave things completely subjective, I'll again give some specific things you can try if your intuition isn't working. 1. Try doing your bass through your nose and mouth simultaneously. The soft palate is responsible for nasality and involved in a lot of vocal system coordination. Blending nasal and mouth resonance seems to get people who may otherwise lack soft palatal awareness to helpfully shift their voice around, resulting in a posture that's conducive to achieving or amplifying lower frequencies. Note, the resonance blending itself isn't causally relevant. We've already debunked just a fifth. 2. Try different tongue positions. The root of your tongue affects the position of your epiglottis, which can affect how easy it is for you to coordinate other components. 3. Try different neck positions. The way you position your neck also affects the coordination of your vocal system. It can squish everything together, pull everything apart, tilt components to one side. My vibration uvula bass is much more consistent when I turtle into a double chin position, while my vibration chest bass requires giraffing my neck, presumably due to my epiglottis needing more space to move around. 4. Pay attention to intervals. Identifying the interval between the vibration version you want and non-vibration version you know will help you estimate how much pressure you'll need to transition between them. Many special basses are really just common techniques but with the slicer effect at certain subharmonics. For example, the difference between normal uvula bass and P-Wad's uvula bass is normal uvula bass is too subharmonic to be meaningfully harmonic. The modulation functions more texturally, while P-Wad's uvula bass is identifiably second subharmonic. Vibration basing from P-Wad's uvula bass will feel more straightforward than vibration basing from normal uvula bass. As an aside, I've heard people call the first subharmonic a fifth down. Like, yes, you're taking a fifth's worth of frequency in the fundamentals octave away from the fundamental, but no musicians talk like this. Otherwise, an octave down from the fundamental would be 0 hertz, which makes no sense. Typically, an octave down means to go to the next octave down. A fifth down means to go to the note where the current note is a fifth above that note. Okay, summarizing step 2. Just tighten your modulator after you've achieved the slicer effect to drop into lower subharmonics or increase intensity of lower frequencies. The key here is after. You want to separate when you work on position versus pressure, regardless of how much your instincts disagree. And boom, you should now be ready to master the art of vibration bass, to master the lowest subharmonic anyone's ever done. Since there's infinite potential, there's infinite subharmonics to super counter remix and inertia in every battle by simultaneously singing more notes than Gary has gym badges to get the ultra mega fusion digivolved level of subharmonics to counter motorcycles and airplanes with nothing more than your puny little vocal system. Look!
But if we don't try, then what the fuck is stopping us from just throwing ourselves off a bridge and giving up and saying, yeah, the planet is dying, the government hates us, the animals are leaving, the aliens aren't contacting us, we might be alone, it just might be you and me, but that's okay, because we really need.
Step 3 is remembering music isn't Dragon Ball Z. Getting lower subharmonics doesn't mean you're more powerful, unless you think every battle you should just stutter once every 2 seconds because that's the 879th subharmonic of A4. Plus, the competition's already over. Beatboxers and singers have lost the title for lowest subharmonic. Inertia, Remix, David Larson, easy. Check this out. Forget the third or fourth subharmonic, this lady's fighting subwoofers. Anyways, don't break something trying to hit a note you're not ready to hit. Work on your non-vibration bass and build up the strength and coordination to get the slicer effect clearly. The control you gain will be useful even if you're not directly practicing the vibration bass you want. You'll save yourself a lot of grief not needing to search for a cocktail of cues to get consistency later. Don't rush things, the journey is worth it. That's basically it. I know some of my viewers are high IQ, so here's some additional analysis. First, we'll address some foreseeable doubt around just sing lower theory. If your voice is at the fundamental while your modulator is at the first subharmonic, why does the fifth, which isn't a harmonic of the fundamentals, show up at all when nothing is producing it? The intensity of the fifth above the fundamental looks like it's being vibrated at more than the subharmonic. I believe this is actually an overtone of the subharmonic. Examining the spectrograms more carefully, we actually see a full set of overtones for each subharmonic, even when the subharmonic itself is barely present. According to research, overtones can be the result of energy getting fed back to the vocal folds. These overtones can happen even when the vocal folds aren't fully activated. I guess the energy producing the subharmonic causes to go back to the vocal folds is enough to result in the vocal folds generating overtones they normally wouldn't, in a similar vein to what the singers claimed about lip bubbling. Note, getting a lower subharmonic does not automatically give you all the higher subharmonics. This is a common misconception. In line with the idea of harmonics, you only get frequencies which are natural multiples of the lowest subharmonic. So the first subharmonic appears if you get the third subharmonic because 1/2 is 2 times 1/4, but not the second subharmonic because 1/3 isn't a natural multiple of 1/4. This is also visually obvious if you understand what a harmonic is. Many people think each line below the fundamental is a different subharmonic, but taking a look back at Alexinho's spectrogram, the first subharmonic is 1/2 the frequency of the fundamental, and the first band below the fundamental is obviously not at the halfway mark based on the y-axis scaling. As an aside, this frequency seems to randomly appear even when you're speaking normally. It looks like the first subharmonic in Fuchs's spectrogram, but its independence from the fundamental in Pewad's spectrogram shows it's not. Not sure what it is, but don't think it's relevant. Okay, but what about the intensities? Remember, what we see on spectrograms is what's resonated, not what's driven. In reality, the vocal bass part of your vocal system is tiny. Without resonance, you might not see anything at all. The subharmonic being weak doesn't mean it's not driven. It just means your vocal tract is not resonating it, which makes sense since your vocal tract's main job is to resonate your voice, not allow you to sound like a robotic duck. To provide physical evidence, I'll vocalize normally, add modulation, then remove my voice. Whoa. I don't have the cleanest bass control, but you should be able to see from the spectrograms, when I remove my voice, the modulator's frequencies don't change. All that happens is the intensity distribution shifts to not favor those my voice produce. This observation should bury any final just a fifth attachments. After removing my voice, there's no fundamental anymore for any of these multiple notes at the same time theories to work, but the subharmonic frequencies still exist because I'm simply singing lower. Plus, all the modulators are way bulkier than your vocal folds. Making them vibrate slower makes a lot more sense than bringing them a fifth above your voice, which many of us beatboxers can't even hum consistently. Throwing an extra wrench in for my highest IQ viewers to contemplate, we still primarily hear the subharmonic even when its intensity is low. This tells us production and reception function differently. Vocal subharmonics are created by simply singing lower, but the created vocal subharmonics are perceived both directly and with something extra. Try checking your recycling bin and think through what I said here about the overtones we see. I'll leave explaining that something extra as an exercise for the reader, viewer. Look, despite my jabs throughout the video, I'm sympathetic to the confusion. The intensities of the just a fifth intervals look like they're being actively driven when compared to the intensities of the subharmonics, which look more illusory. But as I've explained, this way of interpreting things doesn't correspond with how a spectrograph works, even if it feels more intuitive. Next, let's talk about indicators alien bass. I've heard this called first subharmonic, second subharmonic, third subharmonic. It might as well be in a subharmonic superposition at this point. But when we actually put his bass into the spectrograph, this is what we get.
Harmonium.
From the outer space, I am an alien.
At first glance, it looks like this band is the fundamental based on when Indicator says I am an right before the bass hits on alien, implying his technique is first subharmonic. But if you have ears, you know this makes no sense since it's clearly a vibration bass, meaning it's being pushed past his slicer effect limit, and no one needs to vibration their normal voice to get the first subharmonic. Rather, we can pretty easily see, even if we assume our previous fundamental, between that and the first overtone there are two bands. And if you were paying attention to how harmonics work, you'll know this means between F and 2F there are two equally spaced frequencies, i.e. 4/3F and 5/3F, making alien bass a second subharmonic bass. What's actually happening is Indicator does a really tricky pitch bend at the end of an, leading into the first harmonic of his subharmonic, while his fundamental goes back to the same pitch as I am for his bass. We see the same when plugging in the less augmented version from his tutorial.
Cause I'm an alien. I'm gonna teach the bass philosopher.
Actually, while I'm here, let's take a look at Inertia, Remix, and NL as well. Inertia gets a second subharmonic. We can tell by comparing the vibration bass bands to where he does what's probably Jayton voice in his Reckless routine. Remix also gets a second subharmonic. Similarly, comparing to the trailing non-bass vocalization, we're able to figure out where Remix's fundamental is and count the frequencies below. Lastly, and most surprisingly, NL's bass is actually only first subharmonic. It just goes to reinforce my Dragon Ball Z point from earlier. Having great control over your bass is far more important than pulling out lower subharmonics. It looks like he's drawing a maze with his voice, almost like a vocal warble. I've really only seen pitch changes this consistently sharp from whistles. Right, this isn't theory of vocal bass, so I'll just leave some practical homework and get back on track. Vocal subharmonics work inwards as well. See if you can get it for your uvula bass or inward bass. Now let's discuss intervals a bit more in depth. A common thing beatboxers say they do is sing a fifth above their modulator's frequency. Let's look at Gene's vocalized lip oscillation for example. It turns out this is a bit misleading. Gene's making the first overtone of his lip oscillation the point of reference, making his voice a fifth above that reference point. The fifth is accurate from this perspective. I mean, you can hear it modulo the octave, but it's also a bit weird. Generally, it'd make more sense to call his voice the fundamental, making his vocalized lip oscillation second subharmonic. Also, see if you can give a formula for which harmonic of the subharmonic the fundamental's harmonics are. Finally, I want to say there's a lot more to learn about subharmonics. While researching for this video, I found out violins can also create subharmonics. I had no idea this was possible despite how long I've played the instrument. I hope my video will inspire you to keep exploring. With that, we've completed the theory of vocal subharmonics. Once again, please check out Beatblox. Stay awesome, see you in the next one, and yes, I'm aware YouTube is not a scientific journal.